All right, let's dive right into one of the oldest, most foundational stories we have, Cain and Abel. We're going to peel back the layers on this one, look at the language, the history, and what we find might just change how you see this story for good.
You know, when you boil it down, the way most of us hear this story, it kind of sounds like God was just a picky eater, right? Like he just preferred meat over veggies. Was this whole epic tragedy really just about a dietary preference? Well, that's the simple take. But as we're about to see, the original text is pointing to something way, way deeper.
So, to get started, we have to deal with a fundamental problem. It's a problem of time. It's an assumption we all make, and it kind of sets us off on the wrong foot right from the beginning.
See, here's the mistake we often make. We read about an offering, and our brains immediately jump to the super detailed laws given to Moses on Mount Sinai. You know, the whole Levitical system. But here's the thing. The story of Cain and Abel happened centuries before Moses. That whole system of rules for offerings, it didn't even exist yet.
And that's absolutely crucial. To really get what Cain and Abel were doing, we have to hit the rewind button. We have to strip away all that later religious stuff and look at the world they actually lived in. And their world wasn't defined by religion yet. It was defined by ancient politics.
So once we change that lens, the whole picture shifts. Which brings us to our next point. This offering wasn't a religious sacrifice, it was a political tribute to a king. The whole mystery really hinges on one single Hebrew word the text uses for both offerings, minha. Now, much later on, minha became the specific technical term for a grain offering, but back then, in Genesis 4, its main meaning was political. A minha was a tribute, a gift you give to your sovereign, your king.
Think about it like this. In the ancient world, you had this common relationship between a great sovereign king and his subject, the vassal king. The vassal would bring a minha, a tribute, to his sovereign, and it was basically a physical statement. It said, "You are my lord, I am your subject, and I pledge my loyalty to you." It had nothing to do with food. It was all about allegiance.
Okay, so if both brothers were bringing a pledge of loyalty, a tribute to their king, what was the big deal? Why was one accepted and the other wasn't? Well, to figure that out, we have to look really closely at the anatomy of what they actually brought.
And this is where it gets so fascinating. The text is incredibly specific when it describes Abel's tribute. He brought from the Mebekharot, the very firstborn of his flock, the best of the best. And not only that, he brought from their mehel of him, their fat portions, which everyone back then knew was the richest, most valuable part. Abel didn't just bring something. He brought the absolute pinnacle of his life's work.
And then you get to Cain's tribute. The description is just stark. It says he brought some fruit of the ground. That's it. There's no mention of first fruits, no mention of the best quality, just some. The linguistic gap between Abel's specific, extravagant best and Cain's generic some is massive, and it's absolutely intentional.
So now you have these two very different tributes laid before the sovereign king. How does he respond? This is where we need to look at what the text calls the divine gaze, and more importantly, the sequence of that gaze.
The Lord looked with favor on Abel. The Hebrew verb there is sha'ah. Now this is so important. Sha'ah isn't a passive glance. It's not a quick look. It means to gaze intently, to scrutinize, to pay deep, deliberate attention. It's an active, purposeful kind of looking.
But here's the detail that might just be the most important piece in this entire puzzle. The original Hebrew syntax lays out a very precise divine sequence. The Lord looked with favor first on Abel and then on his offering. You see that? The person is always scrutinized before the gift. The posture of the heart is seen before the work of the hands.
Now for Cain, the sequence is exactly the same. God looks at Cain first, then his offering, but the action is a complete reversal. The text says God did not look with favor, and the negative word used here is the Hebrew word lo. And you have to understand, lo isn't a simple no. This is an absolute divine no. It's the exact same forceful rejection used in the Ten Commandments, as in, thou shalt not. So God didn't just ignore Cain, he actively, powerfully, and resolutely refused him. So this brings us to the core of it all. We've seen the what, we've seen the how, but we're still missing the why. What was the unseen catalyst that made the difference between an intense gaze of favor and an absolute refusal? All right, so let's recap what we know. We've got the different qualities of the tributes, we have the different divine actions, one accepted, one refused, and we have the identical sequence of evaluation, person first, then the gift. The only variable left, the only piece that Genesis doesn't spell out for us, is what was going on inside the brothers themselves. What was their inner state?
And for that answer, for the missing piece of the puzzle, we jump forward in the story. The New Testament, specifically the book of Hebrews, acts like a divine commentary on this very moment. It tells us, point blank, by faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. And there it is, the bridge, the unseen catalyst that changes everything, is the word pistis, faith.
So why does all of this matter? Well, it's huge. Genesis shows us what happened. Hebrews comes along and explains why it happened. And it tells us that because God looks at the person before the tribute, he already knew the state of Cain's heart. Without that core of faith, Cain's pledge of allegiance, his Minha, was empty. It was meaningless.
So, when you put all these pieces together, the history, the language, this later commentary, it creates a complete paradigm shift in how we see this story. It's not the simple fable we thought it was. It all boils down to 3 core insights that really change everything. First, we have to trade our assumptions for context. This was never, ever about dietary preference. It was a political act, a pledge of loyalty from a subject to their sovereign king. Second, we see this incredible divine priority. The person always comes before the process. God's piercing gaze evaluates the heart first. Who you are is infinitely more important than what you bring to the table.
And finally, all of this reveals that faith is the true catalyst. It's the invisible element that separates heartfelt allegiance from just an empty ritual. And it's what determines the difference between divine acceptance and absolute rejection.
And that leads us to this one final clarifying thought. God does not evaluate the offering to judge the person. He evaluates the person to judge the offering. The story was never really about the grain or the flock. It was always and only about the heart.